My name is Paul Rosenberger, and I'm a senior in electrical engineering from Sheridan, Indiana, and a member of Project Impact. I would like to welcome you all to the Anne Marie O'Connor Forum hosted by Project Impact. We would like to first take a moment to recognize our series partners, shown on the screen, for helping us put on these events and forums. And specifically for this forum, we would like to thank the Jewish Studies Program, as well as the Tippecanoe Arts Federation for their collaboration in this event. And I believe we have a few members from the Tippecanoe Arts Federation board in our audience. So thank you for coming. We're excited that you're here with us today. Today, we are excited to hear from the author of A Tale of Love, Art, War, and the Crime of the Century. It is an incredible story about the fight to bring famous portrait of Gustav Klimt's masterpiece, stolen by the Nazis, back to its rightful owner. It is one of the great untold stories of World War II brought to life. The story of this painting can certainly fill more than one book, but here is a wonderful overview of how a 90-year-old woman in California was able to win possession of this cherished painting. The following piece, ran on CNBC, was produced by Cecilia Alvear, who is in our audience tonight. We would like to invite her to please stand, and let's give her a round of applause.
On display for the first time in the United States, priceless works of art by Gustav Klimt, with a story as compelling and complicated as the gold mosaic design in his iconic portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, a wealthy member of Austria's Jewish elite in the early 1900s.
We focus on her face, her hands, and the beautiful, exquisite way that Klimt embodies color and light in the canvas.
Adele and her husband Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer were generous art patrons. Ferdinand commissioned and bought the 5 Klimt paintings. For Maria Altman, their niece, the paintings hold a special meaning.
I grew up with those paintings, as they were hanging in the house of my uncle.
Adele dies suddenly in 1925. In her will, she asks Ferdinand to bestow the paintings to the Austrian National Gallery upon his death. But in 1938, Nazi Germany takes over Austria.
They stole those paintings from my uncle. Trucks drove up in front of my uncle's house and robbed him of all his possessions.
Ferdinand escapes to Switzerland, where he dies alone in poverty in 1945. Maria, 22 and just married, flees her home and starts a new life in America. It's later discovered that Ferdinand's beloved Klimt paintings were given to the National Gallery by the Nazis, where they've been on display for the past 68 years. But Ferdinand's last will left the paintings to his nephew and nieces. Maria, the only one still alive, sued to recover the paintings.
The question in the case was, did Adele Bloch-Bauer's request to her husband give the Austrian government a right to these paintings, or was the real heir Maria Altman?
Randall Schoenberg spent almost 8 years fighting the Austrian government to have the paintings returned. At stake, not only the masterpieces, but a part of Maria's childhood and a lot of money.
The estimates on the gold portrait are from incredible to unknown.
Some experts value the 5 paintings at close to $300 million. For Maria, now 90 years old, it's not about the money. It's about honoring her past and her uncle.
I feel I acted in his memory. I felt maybe he would have wanted the paintings here too.
Maria's story, a powerful reminder that some things in life truly are priceless.
It's wonderful.
On the Money, Jennifer London, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Thank you again for joining us tonight. My name is Allison Gayer, and I'm a junior in political science and professional writing here at Purdue. And today we're honored to host Anne Marie O'Connor and George Lewis for discussion of O'Connor's revered work, The Lady in Gold, the extraordinary tale of Gustav Klimt's masterpiece, the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. And the second half of tonight's forum will be a discussion that you are all welcome to ask questions for. I would invite the students, before you ask questions, to introduce yourselves. The microphone, there's one up front, and then there's one in the back as well that's going to be moderated by Heidi. If you could introduce yourself for us.
Hi, I'm Heidi Melton, a senior in corporate communication from Shirley, Indiana.
And if you would just like to raise your hand or move to the back, she'll either bring the mic to you or you can move back there. And then we also have a Twitter feed that's going to be moderated by Alicia and Allison, if you guys could introduce yourselves as well.
Hi, I'm Allison Tucker. I'm a sophomore studying corporate communication and Spanish, and I'm from Warsaw, Indiana.
Hi, I'm Alicia Yadav. I'm a senior in anthropology from San Jose, California.
All right, and the second half, the discussion part, is going to be moderated by George Lewis, an honored correspondent of NBC. He's been honored by 3 Emmys, the George Foster Peabody Award, the Edward R. Murrow Award. He's corresponded from Vietnam, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait, China, Iran, and other nations in Latin America and Asia. He's covered many other trials, oil spills, earthquakes, and the LA and Atlanta Olympics, and he pioneered a series that marked the beginning of interactive exchanges between viewers and television networks. To begin, however, we are welcoming Anne Marie O'Connor. She will be outlining the story of the Lady in Gold for us today. She's an experienced foreign correspondent and culture writer. She attended the University of California at Berkeley, where she co-created an award-winning documentary on the repression of mural artists after the 1973 coup in Chile. She's covered wars, intervention, and guerrilla warfare, and she chronicled the Arellano Felix drug cartel, profiled prominent figures such as Nelson Mandela, Maya Lin, and John McCain for the Los Angeles Times. She's also written for Esquire, The Nation, Christian Science Monitor, and The Washington Post. And her chronicle, The Lady in Gold, has been described as insightful, fascinating, mesmerizing, affecting, profoundly revelatory, lusciously detailed, poignant, and illuminating, just to name a few. So please join me in welcoming George Lewis and Anne Marie O'Connor.
Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Carolyn Curiel of Project Impact and Purdue University for hosting me here tonight. It's great to have my friend George Lewis, who has covered everything since Vietnam, here with me. And thank all of you for coming. This is a story of art and justice, about a painting that for many years was a beautiful enigma like the Mona Lisa. But for me, it was an LA story. I was an LA Times reporter, and one day I read a community news item about a local woman. The Nazis had stolen a painting of her aunt. Oops. It's not clicking. The painting wasn't locked away in an apartment or a mysterious castle. It was in Austria's National Museum. This woman wanted the painting back. It seemed like a lost cause. In those days, people never got back stolen art. I looked at a tiny image of the picture and I thought, that painting? One of Gustav Klimt's decadent Viennese society women, or so I was told in art history.
Clicker's working now.
Okay, dear. Soon I was in the living room of Maria Altman, drinking Viennese coffee, which, with lots and lots of whipped cream, which is apparently some kind of longevity key among Viennese centenarians. Maria was telling me about her Aunt Adele, a woman of today living in the world of yesterday. According to Maria, the women painted by Klimt were not dull society women, they were actually patrons, intellectuals, existentialists, friends of Klimt. Her Aunt Adele might have even had a thing with Klimt. And according to Maria, these women were Jewish. Her story involved Sigmund Freud, Billy Wilder, Hedy Lamarr, Marlene Dietrich, and it seemed unbelievable. But it also seemed impossible that Maria would move the legal case beyond her kitchen. I did a story for the LA Times, but I really didn't think the case would go anywhere. But it did. And as it moved forward in US courts, we learned more about Gustav Klimt and the mysterious women in his paintings. The real story began 100 years ago with a woman named Adele Bauer and Gustav Klimt, who was beginning to paint the remarkable series of portraits that would someday be called Klimt's Women. Here Adele is 16, reading a poem. "Do you recognize me? Do you know who I am?" she sang. Modernism was being born in Vienna, and people were already wondering who they really were rather than who people wanted them to be. Adele's banker father, Moritz Bauer, was knighted for a train line used by the Orient Express. Her mother, Jeannette, was a great beauty. Adele's sister, Teresa, was also a great beauty, a very conventional one. But Adele was a bohemian. Here she has a cigarette in her hand down low on the right. Good girls didn't smoke in those days. A man twice her age was in love with her. Ferdinand Bloch, a sugar beet industrialist, didn't collect modern art. He collected European porcelain. Adele had probably met Klimt by then, the handsome star of the arts world. He was a symbolist, a movement that used mythic figures to represent truths and mood states that may have influenced Freud's dream theory. Adele and Klimt lived in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a very traditional place, but Emperor Franz Joseph had set off Austria's Jewish emancipation in 1848. This was an expansion of civil rights for Jewish citizens who were very limited in where they could live and where they could work. Vienna became a mecca for the families of Freud, Mahler, and Klimt's patrons. These brilliant newcomers embraced new ideas and new art. Empress Elizabeth married Franz Joseph as a teenager, but the Hofburg Palace made her a desperate housewife. She began a bohemian existence, traveling Europe like an early Lady Di. Their son, the Crown Prince, died in a bizarre apparent suicide pact with his teenage mistress. The emperor's brother went to Mexico as Emperor Maximilian, but he was executed and his wife went mad. As modern psychology was being invented, the royals were having a nervous breakdown and setting a bad example for everyone. The emperor tore down the walls that held off the Turks. Now Jewish families were allowed to build palaces along this monumental Ringstrasse. Klimt was inspired by Vienna's gilded ornamentation. Gold represented power, immortality, and the empire itself. But for Klimt, it also represented sensuality. He loved to paint strong women, and not just paint them. Klimt grew up poor with mentally ill sisters. He and his brother went to work in their mid-teens painting palaces and theaters like this one with designs. Klimt's brother and father died young, leaving him with many dependents. Marriage didn't appeal to Klimt, but young women did. Klimt had a steamy romance with Gustav Mahler's future wife, Alma. While Mitzi Zimmermann at Left was pregnant with his son, another woman already had a little Gustav. Some people wondered if Klimt had taken notice of Alma's good friend Adele at this amorous time of his life. The speculation rests partly on this 1901 painting of the biblical Judith as a sexual provocateur. The painting bears a very strong resemblance to Adele, who by then had married Ferdinand. Adele wanted to join Vienna's Bohemian Society. One of its members, Felix Salten, is best known for writing Bambi. In those days, he was a journalist and speculated in the newspaper on which society beauty might have been the model of one of Klimt's sensual paintings or drawings. Salten, at the time, was writing a fictional memoir of a teenage prostitute that was very explicit. That's the one Disney didn't option. Mark Twain came to Vienna in 1897. He had a good friend there, Theodor Herzl, a playwright who would someday be known as the father of modern Zionism. Twain had so many Jewish friends in his 2 years in Vienna that the anti-Semitic press mocked him as der Juden Mark Twain, the Jew Mark Twain. Since biblical names like Samuel were only used by Jewish families, the press said Mark Twain was a cover for his real Jewish name. Twain's daughter Clara married a Jewish composer who first had a thing with Alma Mahler. Freud wrote about the lectures of our old friend Mark Twain. He skipped a psychoanalyst meeting to hear Twain describe instructing royalty in watermelon stealing techniques. Freud cited Twain in Jokes and Their Relationship to the Unconscious and other works. At the time Klimt was leading an artist rebellion, Vienna museums wouldn't display modern art, so the artists decided to build their own exhibition hall. Vienna's progressive Jewish families were crucial. Klimt model Margaret Wittgenstein asked her father to fund this secession building. The Wittgensteins were Adele's landlords. Margaret's brother was the future philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who went to the same Linz high school as Adolf Hitler. Some of Klimt's biggest supporters, Serena Lederer here and her sisters, were cousins of Joseph Pulitzer. Gertrude Felsevani was the maiden daughter of another important patron. Most established aristocrats didn't want Klimt anywhere near their daughters. His erotic drawings were clear enough to show that he did not believe in some of Freud's theories of female sexuality. But for his progressive Jewish patrons, Klimt portraits were risque but prestigious, like a Warhol. Many of these families also supported Freud and the other brilliant people of turn of the century Vienna. With their help, Klimt would create his most experimental works and show them here at the Secession Building. Art was Klimt's naked truth. Creators really believed in those days that art could open people's eyes, music could open their ears, and ideas could open their minds. In this spirit, Klimt turned a commission to decorate Vienna University into a modern art experiment. Critics were shocked. They said this 1900 painting of philosophy made it look like life had no meaning and maybe no God. Medicine was a very sexual, morally ambivalent hygeia. Jurisprudence didn't look like justice was happening at all. A naked man seemed unfairly condemned. Critics called Klimt's new style pornography, like this painting of the Beethoven frieze, Klimt's First Kiss. But his Jewish patrons bought these works and supported him. Klimt retreated into the intellectual salons of Adele's friends. These were women who wanted to be more in a society that wanted them to be less. This pioneer journalist, Berta Zuckerkandel, was one of the few reporters who actually interviewed Klimt. Another was the only woman in Vienna medical school. Women with these unusual ambitions were called degenerates in those days. Even Gustav Mahler told Alma Mahler to stop composing once they were married, and she did, though she seemed to work out the tension in her love life. Women could influence public life with salons. Before television or the internet, intellectual salons in women's homes were like Twitter. Women also wanted to dress differently in this circle. They adopted the loose flowing gowns designed by Klimt's sister-in-law, Emily Flög. Klimt began to rely on portrait commissions in this circle. Klimt began Adele's portrait in 1903. Art historians believe his inspiration was this mosaic in Ravenna, Italy, of the 6th century Byzantine empress Theodora, the wife of Emperor Justinian, who her contemporaries derided in her lifetime as a kind of a brazen hussy. But she's credited with protections for women in Justinian law, and she later became a saint, as we see her here. So there. This 1907 portrait made Adele a celebrity. Critics called her a new icon of Viennese women. Klimt used real gold leaf in this portrait. He put sexually coded designs in her dress, the almond-shaped symbols. The state adopted Adele's portrait as a symbol of their modern empire and the modern women in Vienna. At the same time, Klimt was painting a very sensual Danae, who is conceiving celestially a son whose father was Zeus. Klimt used this same painted mosaic style for the kiss, which also resembles Adele. You can see the connection between gold and sensuality for Klimt. His most sensual portraits use gold at the most sensual time of his life. Adolf Hitler lived in Vienna then. He hated modern art. He was rejected by the Arts Academy a stone's throw from a new mansion Adele and Ferdinand would buy. He lived at a homeless shelter funded by Jewish philanthropists. One Jewish family took him under their wing. A Jewish framer asked his clients to buy Hitler's mediocre watercolors, like this one here. We know how Hitler repaid them all. Klimt painted Adele again. Now they had spent 9 years together. Adele wanted to help Vienna's poor. She called herself a socialist and an atheist. Adele and her friends, like Serena Lederer here, now older, were redesigning their apartments and dress in the style of the Wiener Werkstatt, with simple, clean lines, and everything from jewelry to furniture, like this rocking chair by Joseph Hoffman. The whole idea was kind of to bring the art to the people. They even designed postcards so that everybody could afford to live with some piece of art if they couldn't afford paintings. Klimt at the time was creating his most luscious modernist landscapes, collected by his Jewish patrons, like this one on Lake Attersee that was recently restituted and sold for $40 million. Klimt was preoccupied by mortality at that time. He had symptoms consistent with syphilis. In 1918, he had a stroke, and as Spanish flu swept through the hospital, he died. The Empire died too at the end of World War I. Adele died in 1925, apparently of meningitis. She had asked Ferdinand to leave the Klimt paintings in the Belvedere Museum after his death in her will. Ferdinand turned Adele's room into a shrine with their Klimt collection on her wall. He left Klimt's photograph here on her nightstand where it had been for many years. And then life moved on. Vienna was still a very happening place. Here's Billy Wilder, the American film director, who was a Vienna journalist at that time. He tried to interview Freud, but Freud threw him out of his office. Freud had been ridiculed in the press so much for his theories that he couldn't believe that an admirer had finally shown up. Billy Wilder's parents would go to Auschwitz. Adele's niece is Louisa, getting married here, and Maria on the left were the focus of Bloch-Bauer family life. Here's Louisa before her wedding to Baron Gutmann. Ferdinand now embraced the modern artists Adele had loved. He sponsored a Vienna show of a Klimt protege, Oskar Kokoschka, known for his Bride of the Wind, a painting of his great love, Alma Mahler. When the show opened, the Nazis named Kokoschka a degenerate and seized his paintings in Germany. Thousands of so-called degenerate art museums were seized from German museums. The modernist Vienna architect Adolf Loew once said, "All art is erotic." But for Hitler, all art was propaganda. He wanted art to represent what he considered Germanic values. Ferdinand's niece Maria was a beautiful young woman. She was much more concerned with her romance with an aspiring opera singer, Fritz, than with politics. They married, honeymooned, and 11 days after they got back, Hitler arrived. Maria's family was completely unprepared. They loved Vienna. They thought Vienna loved them back. As Maria's mother said, "We are decent, honorable people." Maria's husband, Fritz, was taken to Dachau, where he sang a song while he worked, "If there is no God on earth, let us all be gods together." Nazi commander Reinhard Heydrich moved into Ferdinand and Adele's Czech great house. His wife remodeled it with Jewish slave labor. Heydrich chaired the conference for the final solution. Klimt's women were now fighting for their lives. Amalia Zuckerkandl here, her father wrote a play with Mark Twain. She had converted to Judaism for marriage, and she probably could have avoided deportation, but she didn't want to be separated from her family, and she went to a concentration camp with her daughter and died there. Elisabeth Bachhoven-Eck tried to save her life by telling a Nazi court Klimt was her real father. Since Klimt was Catholic, this would have made her half Aryan. His reputation came in handy on that one. Jenny Steiner, one of the Pulitzer cousins stranded in Europe, begged her cousin, Joseph Pulitzer's son, to help her get a U.S. visa. He had family back in Vienna. This painting of Klimt's water snakes ended up with a Nazi propagandist and is still actually at large. They've never gotten it back, although I think people know where it is. Aranka Munk commissioned this Klimt portrait of her teenage daughter who had committed suicide over a love affair. Aranka tried to hide out in the country home where this portrait was eventually stolen. Baldur von Schirach was the Nazi governor of Vienna, and he planned the biggest show ever of Klimt's work in 1943. There was a bit of a conflict here for the Nazis. They knew in Vienna that Klimt's erotic drawings alone were enough to get him declared a degenerate artist. And Klimt was a known Philo-Semite, or what the Nazis called a Jew lackey. But not everybody knew this in Berlin. And he was an excellent draftsman. Superficially, he embodied the masculinity of the Germanic Übermensch. He was handsome and virile. His portraits were exquisite. But the women in these portraits were Jewish. So they gave them all anonymous names. Adele's portrait was first presented as Dame in Gold, the Lady in Gold. It was actually the biggest art show ever of Klimt's work. There's never been a bigger one than the Nazi show in 1943. Meanwhile, Adele's beautiful niece Luisa was struggling to survive in fascist Yugoslavia with her 2 children here. When Germany was defeated, the Belvedere was a bombed-out wreck. This is the Belvedere Museum, the National Museum of Austria. The Allies pulled art out of salt mines and castles. 20% of the great art of Europe had been stolen. This is Ike Eisenhower here, going through it. It was just kind of stacked around like cordwood. I mean, there were just thousands of pieces of art at large. Ferdinand was trying to get the portraits of his wife back in his Klimt paintings. He died in a Geneva hotel room a few months after the war and hadn't gotten anything back, not his houses, not anything. His portraits of Adele went to the Belvedere Museum. And then for a long time, what happened in Austria stayed in Austria. Documents of these thefts were locked away. Kurt Waldheim ran for president. He told voters he was drafted into the German army, but wounded in 1941 and spent the rest of the war at the university. But now younger people were examining the past and asking questions. Austrian journalist Hubertus Czernin discovered that Waldheim had actually joined a Nazi organization, spent all of the war years in the German army, and may have been a war criminal. Adele's niece, Maria, decided to try to get the family Klimt collection back, represented by Randall Schoenberg, the grandson of avant-garde composer Arnold Schoenberg. In the midst of this, the Belvedere Museum opened a show called Klimt's Women in 2000. Heirs stepped forward to demand this painting, Klimt's Lady with Hat and Feather Boa, the poster of the show and also of the book that went with the show. A historian said the figure's bedroom eyes no longer seemed to signify an erotic gaze, but rather to convey something more akin to anxious anticipation, as if she were waiting to be picked up by her rightful owners. The contested portraits of Adele prompted a Vienna journalist to compare Austria to a gangster's mall, parading around after a bloody robbery with jewelry she insists the victim gave her. Maria and Randall's case won U.S. court rulings on the right to hear the case in the United States. The Supreme Court ruled in their favor in 2004, and in 2006, a Vienna panel decided that 5 Klimt paintings should be returned to the family. A poster immediately began turning up all over Vienna, saying, "Ciao, Adele, goodbye, Adele." The portrait of Adele was sold to Ron Lauder's Neue Gallery for a record $135 million. The rest were sold at auction, and not everybody was happy about this. One of the heirs opposed even removing the paintings from Austria. Since this case began, Austria has returned a dozen Klimt masterpieces to their heirs. The total thefts included 14 Klimt masterpieces that were burned by the SS at the end of the war, and we saw them in black and white in kind of bad quality because they were not photographed in color. Other stolen paintings are still in people's private collections. Klimt's work is still oddly contemporary looking even after all these years. The restitutions made him more famous. He continues to influence design trends like this collection by Lorenz Scott that was just shown in London and turned up at the Oscars. In 2012, Austria declared the Year of Gustav Klimt and issued a golden euro to commemorate the 150th anniversary of Klimt's birthday. One side has the face of Klimt, the other the face of Adele. Adele is still a symbol of Austria, but a much deeper symbol. Her story is known, and it ain't the sound of music. A great work of art can stand alone, but this painting had an untold legend. Adele Bloch-Bauer was never really a Mona Lisa, the nameless wife of some obscure man. And her friends were not really decadent, anonymous society ladies. This was not just a restitution of art, this was a restitution of history. Now that the stories of Klimt's women are finally being told, maybe it will truly be the year of Gustav Klimt. Thank you.
Well, I'm George Lewis, and I've been a friend of Anne Marie's and her husband, William Booth of the Washington Post, for a long time, as has Cecilia, my significant other, who produced that video segment. So, first of all, can you talk a little more about what turned you onto the story in the first place? And it's a sweeping saga from the swinging years in Vienna through the Nazi Holocaust to the more contemporary effort to get the paintings back. What got you interested in the first place?
Well, when I found the story in the newspaper and went to visit Maria, it just seemed like such an amazing, complex story. It was so beautiful. It was like a Fabergé egg. It just had so many aspects to it. It reminded me a little bit of Dr. Zhivago with everything that happened with the family. But I didn't get into it right away. It actually went on for a long time in Los Angeles before I started writing the book.
But you wrote the book proposal under some interesting circumstances. Can you talk about that?
Well, yeah, you know, I had kind of dithered about whether to do the book. I was really busy. I was a journalist. I traveled quite a bit and covered political campaigns and elections and a lot of different things. But when unexpectedly Austria gave these paintings back, and I got an email around, I don't know, 1 a.m. or a phone call. Somehow Randy Schoenberg told me, the attorney, that this had happened. And no one expected this to happen. No one expected this at the LA Times or really anywhere. But I had written about the case off and on, so he contacted me, and I let an editor know. And, you know, newspapers are very territorial. And at that time, the arts desk thought that they should cover it. And the arts desk and the news desk kind of argued about it. And the arts desk decided that it was their story. And they said, and I was on the news desk, so I was not in their bailiwick. And they said, well, we're going to write it, but if, you know, basically they were kind of taking over the story.
It would be like pulling Woodward and Bernstein off of Watergate in the middle, just before Nixon resigned, sort of.
So it was very frustrating, but it was the kind of thing that happened a lot in, you know, at the newspaper. And the newspaper had been bought by the Tribune Company, so it was going through a lot of corporate turmoil. And everybody was very nervous, and everybody wanted a piece of the action, and they decided that was their piece of the action, even though I'd covered this for years. So I decided not to go to work that day, and I canceled all my plans and a dinner party that night. And I sat down, and first I went to Kinko's and I photocopied copies of all my clips, and which was kind of trouble because there's copyright, but I persuaded them to do it anyway. And they did it, and I went home, and on the way home I dropped by a local store and picked up a 6-pack of Amstelite. And instead of spending 6 months on a book proposal, I just sat down at around 4 in the afternoon and banged it out and sent it to 2 agents, one a very well-known one and one a friend of mine, at midnight. And the next morning, both of them wanted to represent me and asked me if I could just fly to New York. And so I flew to New York, and I immediately got multiple offers. So yeah, I did this in a real sort of fever of anger and frustration.
Don't get mad, get even.
Yes.
You eventually went to Vienna to do research on the book, and I imagine that talking to the Viennese about a very dark chapter in their history wasn't always easy. It probably wasn't something they wanted to talk about, right?
Well, at first they wouldn't talk to me at all, which, you know, I just kind of put that off. No official would receive me, talk to me, or have anything to do with me for about a year. So I went there, and I had other things to do. I had to find people. I needed to find some of these families on both sides, both the Nazis and the Jewish families. So I went to the Viennese telephone directory and just started going through all the last names. And, you know, people would invite me over and tell me their stories. Maria had some old friends in Vienna, and she asked me to look up her old friend Hans, her last old friend in Vienna. And I went over to his house and interviewed him, and it turned out that he had spent the war years, he had survived as a protege of the first Nazi scientists to be smuggled into the United States on Operation Paperclip. And so he was arrested with Werner von Braun. It seemed like everybody in Vienna had a past. Also, there were a lot of still Nazi war criminals who were still alive then. So many that there were still projects to hunt them down. And one day, a British newspaper ran a story with a dashing reporter who had discovered a Nazi war criminal in my neighborhood in Vienna, in fact, a very short walk from where I was staying. And they had a picture of him in the newspaper, and he was, she was opening the door and a little chain through. And all these witnesses came forward and said, yes, she was a concentration camp guard, and she kicked me and beat me and testified against her. And I kind of wondered what the Austrians would do, but in the end, they decided not to prosecute her. But I went to the Vienna telephone directory, and there she was, listed with her name and address. I mean, they must have known about her for years. So Vienna was that kind of place where there were a lot of secrets, but they were really open secrets.
Did they like to gossip a bit, the Viennese?
Oh, yeah, the Viennese are great gossips. Eventually, when they did deign to receive me and let me interview them, they had been gossiping about me for quite some time, and they had a lot of curiosity. They were very curious about whether I was Jewish, and they spent a lot of time trying to ferret out my Jewish side. And they had seen my passport by then because I'd been there several times, and they'd seen my papers somehow. And my middle name is Gerstenberg, which is not actually a Jewish name. It's my mother's family is supposedly Lutheran. But so they questioned me a lot about that. Was the family paying me money to do this? Was Randy paying me money?
So they had a few conspiracy theories about all of this?
Definitely they were, sort of reviving the usual conspiracy theory about the press.
There's one scene in your book that really sticks with me, and that's the bit about the bunker under the Belvedere Art Museum in Vienna. Why was there this huge bunker complex there?
Well, that was, that was one of the open secrets of Vienna. In the year that they wouldn't talk to me, I investigated a lot of things. And one of them was this kind of urban legend I kept hearing from Viennese officials off the record, that underneath the bunker, underneath the Belvedere Museum, there was this enormous World War II military bunker that was supposed to be a refuge for Adolf Hitler in case Berlin fell. Now, Hitler had built maybe 20 bunkers around Europe, but they have only identified about a dozen, and they had never identified the one in Vienna. So I thought, well, this really can't be true. But I had so much time on my hands since no one would talk to me. So I started researching it, and I found a photograph of the bunker being built by the SS in 1943 in a Nazi archive in Vienna that was just kind of gathering dust. No one really bothered to look at it. So I presented this to the Belvedere Museum and pressed them, and eventually they confirmed that this had been built as a bunker for Hitler in Vienna during the Total War.
When you look at the face of Adele Bloch-Bauer, what do you see? I see a worldly woman, some intelligence, maybe a sense of humor. I don't know. What do you see?
I see kind of a yearning, kind of a searching look in her eyes. I mean, maybe because I know a lot about her, I see her as restless and wanting to be more than she was. Judging from her friends, one of her friends went to Vienna medical school, even though everyone booed her and jeered her, and at first she had to dress like a man and pretend like she wasn't a woman. Another one of her friends, Alma Mahler, had serial love affairs with geniuses. I think that often our friends are expressions of who we are. And if so, I think Adele wanted to be more than she was, but I don't think she had the same courage as some of her friends.
Vienna in Adele's time was a pretty swinging place. What was it, sex, drugs, and Strauss waltzes instead of rock and roll?
Sex, drugs, and strudel.
Sex, drugs, and strudel.
Well, yes, they had kind of, free love was a trend then. They were starting free love. And Alma Mahler kind of believed in free love. And
STDs, right?
Syphilis was rampant. Syphilis was the HIV of the day. So, yes, it was a very cutting-edge place at that time. And there was a lot of experimentation in psychology and the arts and everything, but also in sex. And the best cover for a woman who wanted to experiment sexually was being married.
If you wanted to experiment sexually, you got married?
Well, particularly someone of her station. If you were married and you had a lot of time on your hands, yeah, because then if you got pregnant or something happened, it didn't
you
really
had cover, yeah.
your
Okay.
reputation. You had cover. So some of the more notorious lovers in Vienna at that time, like Alma Mahler, were married.
Do you think at the time of the Anschluss, the Nazi takeover, there was a sense of denial in the Jewish community that it couldn't possibly happen to us here in Vienna? Is that why not enough people got out in time?
Well, you know, there was the biggest assimilated community in Western Europe at that time that was that influential. They were really in everything. They were in the arts, they were in science, they were in prominence in all of their fields. They were the most intermarried into high society. They were married to titled people. They felt that they were accepted, that what was happening in Germany was terrible and distressing, but something different, and that wasn't going to happen to them. Particularly the people of the upper class, like Adele's family. Upper class people were so integrated into upper class society that they just thought people wouldn't come after them. Instead, if there were Jewish members of society that were married to Aryans, found that their spouses divorced them and sometimes took all their possessions.
Wow. We're going to throw this open to the audience for questions. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. I believe we have microphones down here at front and one toward the back, right?
And we have Twitter.
And we have Twitter.
So do we have Twitter questions?
Do we have Twitter questions?
Okay, why don't we go first to a Twitter question?
Let's go to a Twitter question.
Okay, this is from Project Impact student Lisa Abrego, and she noticed that a big part of the book is about Vienna culture and history that led up to the painting, and she wants to know, why is the picturesque story so important?
Why is the whole drama important? Because this painting is a symbol of Vienna. It is really a way in which Vienna came together. You really see kind of everything from Mozart to Freud in this painting. It has symbols of the empire. It has a lot of the Viennese influences from the East, from Egypt, from Turkey, from the Byzantine times. It's really where Vienna comes together, and that's why this painting was viewed as so important in its time by the Nazis, and then later on by the Austrians when they were trying to hang on to it. It embodies this world.
Any live volunteers for questions? Do we have more on Twitter?
Yes?
Yep.
So you said in her face that what you see is her wanting to be more than she had. But what do you think is that Gustav Klimt saw in her that matched the sensuality and the power that gold represented?
Well, Gustav Klimt, the question is, what did Gustav Klimt see in Adele, aside from what you can see in the painting? Gustav Klimt was very different than his patrons. He was poor. He was lived kind of on the bohemian fringe somewhat, whereas Adele was a member of society. What did he see in her? She was a rebel. She was a rebel in every way. She believed in the women's vote. She embraced socialism. She was a rebel, and he was too, and that is true of a lot of his models. These women were rebels, and they were more progressive than their society, and I think he was in a different kind of way. Any other questions?
Yes, over here.
How many pieces did the Nazis gather for Klimt's show? I know you said it was the rivals, but how many total pieces have you found?
You know, the exact number of pieces in the show is in the show guide. I think it was like 60 important paintings. Klimt painted 200 really important paintings in his lifetime. He didn't paint a ton of paintings. So close to half, 60 or more, were in this show. Well,
Annie, can you repeat the question so that we can?
the question is, how many of Klimt's paintings have been recovered? Austria has returned 12 of them since this case began. They did return some after the war, so probably recovered altogether more than 20. There would have been, there could be more than 20 more recoveries, except that 14 or 15 of them have been burned. And then there's some others, maybe as many as a dozen, that are still at large. No one knows the exact number because whether the paintings were burned or not is still a subject to dispute by some of the heirs. Some of the heirs to the paintings that were destroyed by the SS officers hope that they'll turn up someday. They hope that they've been floating around and are sold to people on the gray market. There's a gray market that is not public for stolen art in Austria. And people just don't care. I mean, they don't mind if they have a big party at their house because it's wealthy people who trade on the gray market. And they don't mind if people come over to a cocktail party and see a painting that's stolen because there's a certain amount of acceptance of that in Austria. So the heirs are hoping that some of these paintings were not in fact destroyed by fire, that they will turn up someday and they will turn out to have been saved. But certainly some of the paintings were destroyed by fire.
And Maria Altman was worried that she wouldn't live long enough to see justice in this case, but she did, right? What was her emotion when it was finally settled?
Well, you know, when the case was finally settled, it was just so unexpected. The family never really thought they'd get these paintings back. There was kind of euphoria and this incredible excitement and this huge celebration because it wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for all these families who have subsequently, after this case, gotten a lot of art back, and not just in Vienna, but in Holland and all these places all over Europe. Because this case was really crucial. The world looked at this case, and a lot of the European governments thought, okay, we could either be dragged through the slime and the mud for 8 years and then give paintings back, or we could just give them back now. And a lot of governments at that time came forward and started to give things back. So there was that excitement, like, wow, this is an age of restitution, things are really happening and moving on this front. But then within the family, privately, it began to be a kind of a difficult time, sort of like when a family wins the lottery. All of the heirs and their children had completely different opinions on what to do with the paintings and whether to sell them or keep them or donate them. And that went on for a long time after that. So.
When you talk about all these restitutions, there are still some countries that are holdouts, right? That are,
well, sure, there's still stolen paintings
that are dragging their feet.
But some of the most notorious cases that have been dragging on with no justification whatsoever for hanging on to these paintings, were resolved. One of them was the paintings of Jacques Houdsticker, which a Dutch collection. His collection was, I think, 300 paintings. I mean, Rembrandt, everything. In some cases, the Nazi commander Göring went to his house and his castle and just started picking out these paintings himself personally. This collection was so big. Houdsticker was married to a famous Vienna opera singer, and he died trying to flee Europe. And he never got these paintings back, but his family had been trying to get them back. So suddenly in 2006, after the Austrians gave back these Klimt paintings, the Dutch government said, okay, we'll give back the Houdsticker paintings. And I think they actually gave back 200 paintings that were in Dutch museums, and that had to hurt.
The lady in the front row here.
Tell us how Maria,
wait for the mic.
Tell us how Maria Altman and her husband managed to get out of Austria.
The question is how Maria and her husband managed to get out of Austria. Maria waited for him to get out of Dachau. She could have left. Her papers were in order. She had a passport. But she waited for him, which was very risky in those days. The longer you stayed, the less a chance of getting out. She waited through the summer of 1938. They finally started putting together a plot with the help of his brother, Bernhard, in the fall of 1938. They they made sure that she was living under house arrest, and when he got out, so was he. They tried to make sure that they weren't being followed by leaving the house several times for supposed dentist appointments, and the Gestapo never really thought that they didn't suspect that they were trying to get away. So after 2 or 3 times, they realized that they weren't being followed, and then they went to the Vienna airport, which was kind of bold, and got on a plane and flew to Germany, which was, now Austria was Germany, so they didn't need papers to go to Germany anymore. And they took a train and went to the border with Holland. And they stayed at the home of a Dutch farmer, and then they walked across the border at night. And the farmer and his son they had been running this pipeline to rescue Jewish families and get them out, and they were later arrested after this happened. Excuse me? Yeah, and then they flew to England after that and eventually made their way to the United States.
Do we have any more Twitter questions?
Yes, we do. One of the questions from one of our Twitter followers is, what role did the Jewish culture play in the importance of the painting?
Well, that's a very good question. I asked that of a lot of people in Vienna, because modern-day Vienna is a much more sterile place. It's not as creative. It's starting to come back, but there's a lot of nostalgia for what was lost in Vienna in World War II, culturally. It had been such an amazing artistic mecca, and then after World War II, they were never really able to revive this. And so I asked a lot of the officials and writers and artists, what was really the role that the Jewish families played? Why is it so different now? Because none of them came back. And Vienna's kind of a sleepy place with lots of little cafes and museums, but it's just not really happening on some level, although it is starting to come back. And the way a gallery owner summed it up to me was, the Jewish families were the glue. They were the glue. They held the cultural world together. Their support and their enthusiasm and everything that they brought and would later bring to Hollywood and New York and a lot of other places as a diaspora was really vital to Viennese culture. And it was something they could never replace.
Do we have another live question over here?
Hi, I'm Miriam, and my question is now, what precedents does this Supreme Court holding hold for the future? I mean, who's to say that any country now can't claim a painting or a photo that belongs to someone else? Thank you.
Well, that is a very good question, and that's what the Supreme Court was really worried about. When they were debating this, the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act protects foreign countries from lawsuits in the United States. The court feels like this is important to keep making sure that U.S. courts don't host all these extraneous cases from all over the world. This case did set a precedent, and a very important one involving the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, but it's so narrow that it would be difficult for every case to enter U.S. courts under this precedent. The precedent was basically that there's an exception for this shield in cases where countries have been engaging in commercial activity in the United States involving property that was stolen in violation of international law. Now, Randy Schoenberg was able to establish this jurisdictional precedent in a very unique way. He drove around from bookstore to bookstore in Southern California until he finally found a book that had a reproduction of the painting on the cover. And it was being marketed by the Belvedere Museum, by the Austrian National Museum. So he used this to establish jurisdiction. And the federal court accepted this in LA, and then they accepted it in Northern California, and they accepted it in the US Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court there said that the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act could be applied retroactively of its creation. In other words, it could be applied in 1948, even though This law was not created until the 1970s as a law with statutes. So it was I think the court felt like this was a very narrow precedent and it wouldn't necessarily apply to everything, but it's a good question because people can now use this to justify US jurisdiction for a lot of cases. And that's what the Bush administration was worried about when they filed a brief suggesting that the court not rule in favor of this case, but they did anyway.
I think we have time for one more question. So
Over here, we have a question right here.
I was just going to ask, you mentioned that some of the, I guess, Klimt paintings were burned by the SS, and Klimt wasn't Jewish, and I'm wondering if, kind of an oddity, the paintings were burned because the subject matter, or the subjects themselves were Jewish. I guess that's my question.
Well, no one knows exactly what happened at that fire. I did talk to a member of the family that lived in this castle when it happened. And this guy was a baron there when he was he was like the youngest baron in a family of barons. He was 12. He told me a description of the events. There was actually a lot of ammunition stockpiled there. So when the SS set off the explosives, this stockpile of ammunition that was upstairs blew up the castle, so it just blew it out. Now, these SS officers were some of the true believers. They were some of the real holdouts, and they were supposed to destroy everything in advance of the Red Army. So the Russian army was coming, and they're destroying castles and places where they could stay. This was known as the Nero Decree that Hitler decreed before he committed suicide. So this was a group of SS officers and also brown shirts that were really true believers, and they probably would have blown up anything. Now, there may have been a method to their madness. They may have been targeting Klimt. It's entirely possible. They burned some of his most experimental paintings, also a painting of two female lovers called Girlfriends, and these were his most experimental artworks. Now, if that was a coincidence, I don't know. But they did certainly burn some of his most significant experimental works.
since I recognize the professor, I'll give him the last question.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. This is meant to be kind of a devil's advocate question. It might also be a way for you to wrap up, talking about sort of why it matters to us in America and in other places that these issues be resolved. To put it in one form, art that had been hanging in a very public space is now being turned over into private hands. And so in some ways, the public is losing these images, even though the rightful heirs are getting control over these images. Now, you framed this as a triumphant story of justice. And I think that most of us would probably agree. We're glad that this is how things are going. But how would you say that, what would you say as the broader significance for Americans in seeing this kind of outcome with private families, possibly with a good deal of capital and wealth already, having this art in place of public institutions? Right.
Well, not all the heirs agreed. Actually, one is furious about it to this day, one who lived through the Holocaust. But so, important paintings that belong in museums are sold every night at Christie's. So there's tons of art that's not in the public eye that really ought to be. Also, these paintings are out of sight now, but in a few years, I think that they will probably surface and eventually make it into museums. We'll see about that. But I think the greater historical lesson that was learned here was this history and an area of European history that had not been explored, the role of these Jewish collectors, the role of these patrons in the creation of the art of one of the most recognized artists now. This is probably more true of Klimt than many other artists. He painted the Jewish aristocracy of Vienna, but he was also, to some degree, a product of them and their strength and their affluence and embrace of avant-garde ideas. I think for Austria, it was really most important, much more important in some ways than for the United States. They'd been looking at these paintings all their lives and really had no idea of any of this history. They didn't know who the women were. So I think that for Austria, it was a huge eye-opener, and I think for many of them, particularly the older ones who lived through the war, it was very disturbing. Suddenly, paintings that they loved and were very familiar with, they realized they hadn't really known these paintings at all. They became like Freudian symbols of just sort of very disturbing things for some of these people. I would say that for the Austrians, it was much more important, really, even in the United States. But I think that for the United States, it was also somewhat a resolution of a lot of unfinished business. I think that some Americans found this very satisfying. You have to remember that a lot of people got back nothing. Just most people didn't get back anything. So this is kind of a small, very visible tip of the iceberg. And is it a good thing to take art out of the public eye? No. I hope these paintings will come back in museums and people will be able to appreciate them. Although honestly, paintings are so endlessly reproduced now that people can see them, if not physically. But I think a greater lesson was learned here, and now these paintings mean much more than they did.
Well, thank you, Anne Marie, and thank you for bringing the Lady in Gold to Purdue.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, my name is Ari Swartz. I'm a senior in public relations from Charlestown, Indiana. And before you all leave, I'd like you to join us in thanking our special guests for taking time to speak with us tonight. So I would like to invite Lisa Abrego, a senior in public relations and political science from San Salvador, El Salvador, and Andy Mansouri, a junior in political science from Zionsville, Indiana, to come to the stage. And these two Project Impact students have a gift for both of our gifts.
Oh, thank you.
Both of our guests.
Oh, wow. Swag. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. We really appreciate it. Please be sure to join us for our final event of the semester. It's a master class with C-SPAN founder and executive chairman Brian Lamb. It will be on Thursday, April 11th at 9:30 a.m. in Lawson Hall, room 1142. 9 a.m., I'm sorry, in Lawson Hall, room 1142. You can find more information about it, that's probably correct, on our website. It's purdueimpact.wix.com/main, and you can find all the information there. Thanks again for coming. Have a great night and great travels.
Project Impact students, please come on the stage, take a picture.
Oh, okay. Cool.